Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or JSOU. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.us as indicated on the slide.
Hey, good morning, and thank you for joining us for a special discussion on key concerns for planning operations in the cyber domain. I'm Dr. Mark Grzegorzewski, JSOU Resident Senior Fellow, and today I'll be conducting a Think JSOU interview with Adam Maruyama. Adam is a national security professional with more than 15 years of experience in cyber operations, cybersecurity, and counterterrorism. He served in numerous war zones and co-led the drafting of the 2018 National Strategy to Counterterrorism. He currently manages cybersecurity software deployments for a number of federal and enterprise customers. We're pleased to have such a distinguished guest join us for what will surely be an illuminating talk. His talk will highlight 3 concerns for planning operations in the cyber domain from a former policy, strategy, and operational planner in the DoD and intelligence community. Welcome, Adam. We'll have Adam for the next 45 minutes. So as we speak, please populate the chat box with your questions, and I'll pose them to Adam. Adam, as you have noted, much has been said about the commonalities between cyber operations and special operations. But there are also inherent and intractable differences when conducting operations in the cyber domain. Adam, let's jump right into it by asking you to scope what you mean by cyber operations.
Thanks, Mark. And before I start, just wanted to thank you and thank JSOU for your partnership and the opportunity to speak today. You know, when we talk about cyber operations, I think people often mean a lot of different things. But I think for the purposes of this talk, we'll limit cyber operations to those operations that are conducted in or primarily within the cyber domain that are intended to achieve an end there. And you know, I think one of the contextual notes here is that we have conducted warfare for thousands of years based on the laws of society and even to a greater extent the laws of physics. Those are governed by an intuitive common sense, that's informed by not only studies of trajectory and ballistics, but also intuitively interacting every day with the world that we live in. But I think my point here is that those rules don't always apply in the same way in the cyber domain. So it's beneficial to think about things a bit differently when you plan a cyber operation. And I've shared with you before sort of 3 points using the analogies of warfare, but also pointing out the differences in cyber and physical warfare. I think these 3 points, and we can elaborate more on them, is 1, in cyberspace, your enemies can shoot your bullets back at you. 2nd, in cyberspace, when you throw a grenade, you may not know where exactly it's landing. And finally, that if you're trying to take down a web page or achieve a cyber objective, sometimes it takes a village to raid that web page.
Sure. And I think you bring up a great point when you say, in cyberspace, your enemies can shoot your bullets back at you. Would you mind expanding upon that thought?
Yeah. Basically, the bottom line here is that in cyberspace, a sufficiently advanced target or even a third-party observer can basically deconstruct your cyber weapons and turn those techniques back at you. We saw this to great effect for the bad guys when the shadow brokers leaked a version of NSA's Eternal Blue exploit, which fueled ransomware attacks around the world. As we see trends in the cyber defense industry, like cloud-based network and endpoint monitoring systems that send telemetry data not only to your computer's logs, but back to cybersecurity companies, this means that any exploit is potentially visible, not only to the target, but to experts in the field. And that's not a bad thing. From a cyber defense perspective, that means that our systems as a government, our systems as critical private sector industries are more hardened, but we have to think about that as attackers when we plan these cyber operations. In the best case, when an attack is defected, a cybersecurity vendor could discover the exploit and just stop that execution in its own product or alert the manufacturer through commercially accepted due diligence practices. Again, on net, this helps the defense of cyberspace as a whole and is not that big a loss except to an individual operation. In the worst case, however, the exploit could be undetected by commercial actors, but detected by a nation state who decides rather than reveal it, they repurpose it for their own covert nefarious purposes. This risk is increased in effects-based rather than espionage operations, where targets would start to know to look for a weak link. In espionage, the point is not to get caught, so you may fly under the radar for longer. The key takeaway to me here is not don't use cyber weapons ever because they won't remain a secret for long. I think my key takeaway here is if you're planning an effects-based operation, just consider that tool you're using. Would you want it to be visible from both a technical development perspective, all the resources that went into making it, where else it's deployed, and potentially subject to reverse engineering by your target, by transit networks, and by endpoint security providers, or network security providers for that matter.
Sure. So building upon your second point, you mentioned that in cyberspace, you may not know where your grenades will land. Could you unpack that for me?
Yeah. If we think back 20 or 30 years ago, you would have relatively solid knowledge, given a web address, which country that server was located in. Now, when we talk about non-governmental targets, such as terrorists, their email server may not be located in the same country where they're located. And we saw in the publicly available after action for Operation Glowing Symphony, just how the different views of sovereignty with regard to different ISIS web servers went. Now, however, we're in an environment where we have an increased presence of cloud-based hosting and content delivery networks, which means that even the organization who owns content and puts it up on the web may not know where that information is located on any given day. Which means that your shot at either a foreign adversary or a non-governmental agency may not land in the same territory in which your target is located. And not all governmental authorities will view your actions as targeting only the group that controls the content. The analogy that I make here is if someone were to, if the terrorist group were to host, let's say, anti-government of India content on a server, Hotmail server here in the United States, our strong preference, I assume, would be that their government contact the Federal Bureau of Investigations, who could then take legal action against that server rather than going and hacking Gmail or Hotmail rather. And this is exacerbated by the point that this isn't just webmail providers. Anyone with a credit card, or worse, for tracing a crypto wallet and an internet connection, can rent cloud servers that are continuously moving between locations and can have these potential geopolitical ramifications on other data that's located on that same server, or just potential violations of sovereignty. You make that worse if you're installing a tool that's persistent, because content distribution networks, things that are designed inherently to duplicate content across several geographic locations to make transit of the internet faster and easier for the end user, could unwittingly populate that tool across multiple geographic locations for ease of routing, which would increase both those sovereignty concerns and your risk of discovery. Going back to my first point. So I think, the key point to take away here is don't assume that liaison and your counterparts in hosting countries will always take the most charitable view toward the end goals of your operations, even if you're aligned with the hosting countries on those endpoints. Again, going back to Operation Glowing Symphony, which for those who don't know, was a counter-ISIS operation undertaken by US Cyber Command. There are very few governments who like ISIS, but even then there were serious concerns more along the lines of the FBI example that I brought up earlier. Not so much that people didn't like the fact that we're taking down ISIS content, who doesn't want to, but that they'd rather do it themselves and not put servers and larger sovereignty ramifications at risk.
Adam, to your third point, what do you mean when you say that it takes a village to rate a web page?
Yeah, Mark, when I scoped this talk at the beginning, I talked about operations within cyberspace or having a goal within cyberspace. That means that we don't need to conduct a cyber war exclusively within cyberspace. Those cyber effects can often be achieved and with less technical risk and with more lasting impact by other means. At the kinetic end of the spectrum, this means if your adversary is hosting their content on on-premises servers in a war zone, kinetic destruction of that comms infrastructure is going to have a potentially longer lasting impact than hacking into that server. In more friendly nations, especially our technically advanced partners, if we think about France, if we think about Israel, there may be a much lower risk option to try to work with law enforcement and or intelligence in those countries to suspend accounts or have them take action rather than us taking action that may be viewed as a violation of sovereignty or may affect other data that is resident on the same devices as the data that we're trying to impact. So this just means that we need to take a whole of government approach to achieving US goals in cyber domain, right? This is all instruments of national power effort, not a military only effort. I think that close collaboration between military, law enforcement, intelligence, and diplomatic liaison to get to yes on the goals of an operation rather than simply trying to demonstrate capabilities will go a very long way to achieving the goals of the United States in cyberspace without jeopardizing policy norms that may make us in the long term more vulnerable to cyber attacks and cyber warfare, as well as from a technical perspective, the security of the tools and techniques that we're using, and moreover, help to ensure from a defensive standpoint that they don't get used against us or locked out of use for those situations where they really are the only resort.
Sure. So as the moderator here, I'm going to take the prerogative and ask the first question. And hopefully, as I do that, our viewers will think of their own questions. I want to go back to your first point that the bullets can be shot back at you in cyberspace. Clearly, there is a challenge here, right? In that if we deploy some sort of exploit, it can be modified and shot back at us. Is there also an opportunity here? And I don't know offhand what the opportunity might be, given that a lot of the world uses American technology. But can we also, is there an opportunity for us to take, say, malware that works on an exploit for a Chinese tech company and shoot it back at them, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two opportunity spaces here, actually. There is capturing others' exploits. I think we are one of the most technologically advanced nations in the world, and cybersecurity, advanced in developing our cybersecurity exploits. I don't know, and cannot comment from any kind of past experience what the delta looks like there and where one of our adversaries may have a more advanced capability than we do. But I think the more The bigger opportunity actually lies, if we think of strategically of the cyber domain, in the defensive space. We have the ability to see the bullets, reverse engineer the bullets that are coming at us, that are coming at American manufactured, American designed software, or even software that is commonplace in America, right? We don't have to only patch American software, but finding those vulnerabilities, conducting whatever intelligence we need to gain better knowledge of our adversaries, but then sharing it with industry, sharing that information so that people know that serious actors are using these exploits will help us to develop a more secure cyberspace, and I think very much increase our defensive posture as well as our offensive options.
Sure, sure. I have one more question for you, Adam. You brought up, it takes a village to raid a web page, and you spoke about, the different agencies that need to work together in doing this. And for lack of better terminology, all those seem to be kind of offense focused. Do we also need to bring in an organization such as CISA to think about, should there be a response action from an adversary to defend our networks? Should we just be bringing in the FBI, Treasury, DoD, or again, should we focus more on defense of the homeland too?
I think that's a great point, Mark, and a point well taken. That defenders need to be in the picture as well, both to sort of mitigate against those bullets being shot back at us, but also as we think about norms and as we think about the comparative advantages of repurposing a technology to use for, or purposing a discovery in the first place offensively rather than responsibly disclosing it. And at the second tier, as we see attacks coming in, very much bringing those defenders to the table to discuss whether it is more advantageous or not to use something for intelligence purposes, or to use it to defend, the broader cybersecurity enterprise, which includes in this context private partners.
Sure. Thank you. There's been a lot of changes, I'd say, in the first year of the Biden administration to cyberspace policy. In regards to locking down networks more. Have we made important gains over the past year in preventing the kind of the scourge of ransomware that we saw in 2020?
I don't know if important gains is the right magnitude of statement, but I think we're taking things in the right direction, right? Two things that I would like to especially commend our partners at CISA for, and those are BOD 2201 and ED 2202. BOD 2201, which addresses government use and securing against a list of many specific vulnerabilities that are known to be used by advanced persistent threat actors, and ED 2202, which addressed at a very aggressive timeline, particularly for federal government, but for anyone, the significant threat posed by the recent Log4j hacks. So both of those, I think, represent CISA, and in full disclosure, Jen Easterly, the director, is one of my former bosses, have the greatest respect for her, but very much represent CISA taking a war footing toward attacks against the US and cyberspace, and trying to defend against those attacks as quickly as possible and move much faster than the traditional speed of government. So all due kudos to not only Jen Easterly, but Ann Huber, Chris Inglis, and the entire cybersecurity team there.
So the question comes from Kyra. Do you think the US is disproportionately vulnerable to cyber operations compared to our main adversaries?
Disproportionately vulnerable is a a difficult and interesting concept. I think the US was disproportionately vulnerable when a lot more of the US was online than our other countries. I think that now, from a country standpoint, we should not look at nation by nation vulnerability to attacks. I think the perspective we should be taking is this global cybersecurity attack surface. Because a vulnerability in one product, if we look back at SolarWinds around this, which we were all freaking out around this time last year, that was not a US product, but it was widely deployed in the US and many other countries. So really cybersecurity vulnerabilities are now global vulnerabilities, unless we're talking about things like the Chinese firewall, the Great Firewall of China, so to speak, where some countries are very, very segmented from the internet. I'd say that they're disproportionately less vulnerable than the rest of the world, but I think really there is a global baseline from which others may differ, and I don't see the US as off that baseline in a notable way. If we think about the US government, again, the speed of action and speed of defense, I think any large bureaucracy lags. So I would say large governments are probably disproportionately vulnerable in some way, and that they are coordinating action there is more challenging than it would be in a smaller and more agile organization. But I think that's a disadvantage of scale. And as I've mentioned before, I think the current administration is taking the right steps to take cybersecurity seriously, realize that this is a war footing, and demand quicker action.
This talk will be posted to YouTube. There's much valuable content that Adam has shared with us today. Adam, I would like to thank you for dialing in and sharing your experience and insights with us. I definitely found it worth my time, and thank you to our viewers. I certainly hope you learned as much as I did. This has been a Think JSOU conversation. Please join us for future conversations related to the special operations community. Signing off.